mean, this is a book about preparing to die that's also directed for those dealing with any transitional situation, with any ending. And even more fundamentally, it's really a book about life. And that's what I want to try to kind of decode for you, to show you how this magisterial tome is very much and as much a guidebook for how to live. So in my own experience working with this text for decades, nothing has ironically, paradoxically brought me more fully into life than contemplations on impermanence and death. And allegedly, the Buddha, the awakened one himself, once said, of all the footprints, the footprint of the elephant is the deepest and most supreme. Of all contemplations, the contemplation on impermanence and death is the deepest and most supreme. And like this religious scroll behind me, what's called the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of life, the character holding it, this guy here, this little kind of monstrous dude, his name is Yama, which means really Lord of Death. And what he's doing is he's holding the wheel of life. We'll be talking about this during the course. This is in many ways, well, I guess you could say, the intellectual content of enlightenment. This is what the Buddha discovered the night of his awakening under the Bodhi tree some 2,600 years ago. And one of the things that's compelling about this is that when you actually embrace life, hold it within the framework of death, within the embrace of death, it actually empowers your life. I mean, think about it, really. If you were to realize in your bones that the conversation you're having with the person, the place that you're at, is possibly the last conversation you'll have or the last time you see this place, it doesn't dilute from the experience. It's not a morbid reflection. It's an empowering contemplation. It actually charges your experience of life. And when I had the really precious, bittersweet opportunity to spend the last hours with loved ones like my parents, one of the great gifts that they both left me with, it was almost like as they were leaving, transitioning from this world, those beings that so generously brought me into this world, gave me the gift of life, were giving me the gift yet one more time. That by embracing my precious time with them as they were dying, I wasn't thinking about tomorrow. Yeah, I was reflecting a little bit about the past nostalgically, but I found myself just absolutely riveted to the present moment, because I realized deep in my bones that this is the last time I would be spending with them. And so part of what this amazing book does for you is, in fact, by holding everything with the embrace of impermanence and death, it really brings you more fully into life. But as for the text itself, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is arguably one of the greatest spiritual masterpieces in world history, certainly in the Buddhist tradition. And if anybody here tried to read this book, if you ever try to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it is certainly one of the most impenetrable. There are at least 10 translations out there. I am a nerd. I love this topic. I've read them all. And I'm going to do just a tiny bit of show and tell for you. This is the very first translation by Lama Kazi Dawa Samtup in 1927, edited by W.I. Evans Wentz. And it's actually interesting. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is actually a misnomer translation. Its title is actual authentic translation from the Tibetan. Bardo Tudril Chenmo means the great liberation through hearing in the between. Well, that's not exactly a sexy title. That's not going to sell books. The great liberation through hearing in the between. And so in 1927, the publishers elected to translate it as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And even though there have been at least 10 translations since then, everybody has somewhat, unfortunately, but understandably, sustained this mistranslation. Bardo is a really interesting multivalent term, B-A-R-D-O. It's getting a little bit more traction these days, especially with George Saunders' really compelling experimental novel, Lincoln and the Bardo. The word literally means, it's a Tibetan word that means gap, transitional process, or in between. So when they're talking about Bardo Tudril Chenmo, that's the Bardo, the in between. New translations keep coming out. Here's, I'll show you some of my favorites. This is one by my dear friend, Professor Robert Thurman. This one's really rich because it has a fantastic commentary by Dr. Thurman. Here's one by Donald Lopez, who's a brilliant scholar. These are among my favorites. But I would have to say that of all the ones that are out there, this is the best. This is the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the first complete translation by Gyurme Dorji, with his commentary and introduction by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's the first, you can see how thick this puppy is. It's the first complete translation, in other words, all 17 chapters, of which scholars know that the actual Tibetan Book of the Dead, this little guy is just one chapter. This actually is my favorite translation. This is the second one that came out some 50 years after the first one, written by Chogyam Trungpa and my dear friend Francesca Fremantle, who's just a tremendous Sanskrit and a Buddhist translator scholar. I have had the great opportunity of working with this text for decades. And in my meditation center for, I think it was like 7 or 8 years, I read an annual reading of the entire book, cover to cover. It took about 8 hours. And so I had a chance to read it out loud, run a commentary with it. And every single time I read my favorite translation or each new one that keeps coming out, every time I read a new translation, it's just like the onion layer effect. It's just more and more depth and nuance and profundity came out. The best commentary on it is, in fact, by Francesca Fremantle. This is called Luminous Emptiness, Understanding the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This is a masterpiece of a commentary. I will be relying on that one fair amount during the upcoming course, because not only is Francesca a dear friend of mine, but her rendering of this text is without peer. One more, actually a couple more. The Hidden History of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the deepest dive into exactly the cryptic, mysterious kind of truly tantric nature of this text. And then just to show you, there's the Tibetan Book of the Dead for reading out loud. That's kind of cool. And then here's the illustrated Tibetan Book of the Dead. And then there's videos and documentaries and commentaries. It's just received so much attention and press throughout history, and in particular over the last 50-some years. This is an amazing text. It's called a dharma text. Dharma is Sanskrit for treasure text. And what this means is it was written by a gentleman, his name was Padmasambhava. He's sometimes called the Tantric Buddha or the second Buddha. He was the guy who came from what is now Pakistan, Udayana, in originally northwest India. And at the invitation of one of the kings of Tibet, was invited to come from India to Tibet to really translate Indian Buddhist wisdom into the Tibetan continent. It was written in what's called twilight language or Dakini code. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And then it was hidden literally in this mountainside, almost like the Gnostic Gospels that were found at Nag Hammadi. Amazing amount of religious texts, not only just in Buddhism, but in other traditions, were written and then hidden and revealed at the appropriate time for future generations. So it was tucked away at this place called Gampadar, which is a mountain in Tibet. It was discovered by this master whose name was Karma Lingpa. Little heavy lifting with the terminology on the front end, and then we'll go on into cruise control here. And Karma Lingpa was what's called a Ter Tun. He was a treasure discoverer. And so he was the gentleman who revealed this text and then started to write commentary and propagate it. But everything about this text is shrouded in mystery, partly because it does come from the Tantras. It comes from a monumental Tantra called the Guhya Samaja Tantra. And those of you who study Tantras in any language, Indian, Tibetan, Sanskrit, or whatever, you realize they are almost by definition impenetrable. They almost always, in fact, every single one I've tried to read, mandates commentary. They're self-secret in that regard by design, which keeps the dilettantes away, keeps the shoppers away. And so not only will I be relying on the commentary from true meditation masters, but I will be relying on my own kind of cultural translation. I'm not so much a liturgical translator, but I consider myself sometimes a cultural translator. which I think is arguably just as important. I mean, how can we take these amazing historical texts, update them, bring them into the 21st century, and show how these ancient teachings apply to the modern mind? So that's part of my charter in this course, is to do a kind of cultural translation, not only bringing it up into the 21st century, but again, as I alluded to at the outset, showing you how this stuff applies to any situation that ends. So according to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, to show you how this book was authored and its kind of certitude, its authenticity, according to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and other actually non-dual traditions, fully awakened beings, fully enlightened beings, for such realized beings, there's no such thing as death. And there's a famous video, if you get a chance to see it, called The Lion's Roar, which is a wonderful documentary about the life of and death of His Holiness, the 16th Karmapa. And there's a marvelous scene at the end of the movie, just before he's dying, where one of his students is kind of disconsolate and weeping at his feet. And Karmapa looks upon him with just tremendous kindness and compassion and smiles and says, nothing happens. Nothing happens. And so for someone who's already that awake, who's fully lucid, fully awake, these amazing individuals, and we'll be talking about this, they literally do not sleep, they do not dream, they do not die. What they simply do, not simply, in a very sophisticated way, they go, unlike us in the West, who kind of go from awake, asleep, dead, alive, yes, no, black, white, kind of this binary way of relating to mind and reality. These amazingly evolved individuals, not just in the Buddhist tradition, but all the great wisdom traditions, when they transition into sleep or into dream or into death, where parenthetically in the Buddhist tradition, death is actually referred to as the dream at the end of time. And I have written a lot about the correlations between sleep, dream, and death, at least 3 books on it. And so I'll be bringing a lot in this course about how dream yoga, which is a more sophisticated form of lucid dreaming, is actually one of the penultimate preparations for death. And so these remarkable individuals, they just go from gross to subtle to extremely subtle dimensions of mind, kind of replacing a light switch model of consciousness that we have in the West, this kind of binary mode of looking at reality and mind with kind of Eastern dimmer. And so using that metaphor, they leave a couple photons of awareness on, so to speak. And therefore, the fully formed aspect of their being, their body, and even their what we can know conventionally as mental content and thought, that absolutely positively ceases. That's impermanent, that does die. But there is, in fact, according to these wisdom traditions, a dimension of their being, which really is also a dimension of our being. They're no different than us. They simply just woke up to their true nature. There's a dimension of their being and our being, a fully formless dimension that doesn't transition. That's, formless, really, formless means deathless. And that is the fantastic contribution of this book. It points out the fundamentally deathless nature of our being. And so here's one way to summarize the entirety of the Bardo teachings. And so this is characteristic. These teachings come from what's called the Tantra lineage, or another term is Vajrayana Buddhism. And one of the characteristics of Tantra Vajrayana in Tibet is you kind of start at the end. You start with the fruition. That's why it's called the fruitional vehicle. And then the path becomes stabilizing what is pointed out. And so right here, we're just going to go right to the top. I'm going to hit you with the summation of this text that I'm going to then unpack in this course. And then through the remaining of my time with you this evening, backpedal a little bit and show you a little bit more how this works. So here's the fundamental kind of logic and trajectory of this amazing text in the Bardo teachings altogether. You could say that really its charter is to allow us to realize that if in fact there is no delineated ego self, which is alive even now, then the problem of life and death is solved. So in other words, in many ways, you could say this is the Buddha's goal in the Bardo teachings, to experience that which cannot die, because it was never born. Let me say that again. To experience that dimension of our being which cannot die, because